So I decided to make a short follow-up video to my year-end reading list about books I did not finish in 2022. I'm leaving off ones I stopped because they turned out to be radio plays when I wanted them to be audiobooks, but for the other ones, I have a list of 10 that I could not finish. The first one is a short story called Martin Misunderstood. It's a short story about a middle-aged loser who lives with his awful mom and has a bad job, and he gets set up for murder. It's only 3 hours on audio, but I hated it. The main character is unlikable and not in a fun way, and it's weirdly racist. There's this sassy black woman stereotype as Martin's assistant, who's both mean and bad at her job and full of herself. And Martin makes a point of thinking she's unattractive, which he doesn't do to the other women he meets in the book. And she's shown as being vain for thinking that he's into her and pre-rejecting him, and he's grossed out by the idea of her thinking that he's into her. And it's really, really unnecessary and gross. The second one that I could not finish was Beowulf, and it's just because Old English is hard. I couldn't. It was so hard. The third one was Race to the Sun. I just realized, like, a chapter in that I was too old for reading it. It is a juvenile fiction book, especially because most audio readers for juvenile fiction tend to sound like they're saying, wow, with the intonation of all of their lines. Haunted House Murder. This was 3 Halloween short stories put together, but I just couldn't get past the beginning of the first one. There was too much homeowners association nonsense, and I just can't deal with HOA drama. The Boy on the Bridge, a prequel to The Girl with All the Gifts, but I quickly decided the angle it was coming from wasn't a prequel story I was interested in. The Wedding Date. This was a really popular romance, and I don't normally read romance, so I was hoping this would help me get into it a little bit more, but the stakes just disappeared like a third into the book. The fake dating scenario was over, the couple had already discussed all of their lies and misunderstandings that they had with each other, and they were casually seeing each other like adults and communicating about their relationship. Like, what are the stakes? Like, nothing is happening anymore. Under the Banner of Heaven. Skip to the next book if you can't handle anything rough right now, because I'm going to get into it. This is a true crime book, and it was actually assigned reading in a college class, and I didn't finish it at the time because I was too busy with other classes. This time, I finished it around the same part in the book, but it's because of how they talked about Elizabeth Smart. Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped at age 14 and taken as a second wife to a man who believed himself to be a prophet. Elizabeth was missing for several months, and even when confronted by police, she did not initially confess to her identity or seek help from strangers. Elizabeth Smart was raised Mormon and an ex-fundamentalist woman in the book who grew up in polygamy and was in a bad polygamist marriage, said she fully believed that Elizabeth went with this man because she was a Mormon who was raised to obey men and listen to religious authority figures, and the author just does not challenge this assumption. This is frankly victim blaming. The truth is, Elizabeth Smart was a child who was taken from her home at knife point, raped repeatedly throughout her kidnapping, was chained, starved, abused, and had her kidnappers threaten to kidnap her younger sister as well, something that seemed very possible to her as she had been successfully kidnapped. And the couple had also attempted to kidnap her cousin shortly after she was taken. She listened to her kidnappers, not because of an authority issue or because they were claiming to be prophets or because she was taken by a man. She listened to them because she was tortured and abused. Elizabeth did not believe the man who was saying he was a prophet, and she did not respect their authority. She was in danger. The cases in which she didn't reach out were ones where she was around strangers and very near her kidnappers. She was in a place where she could not trust other people, and she had good reason to believe she would be further tortured if she tried to get help and someone didn't believe her or she did not succeed. In one instance, a police officer tried to confirm her identity, and in a documentary about this case, police from the area seemed to imply that it was because they had to respect religious freedom, because the kidnapper claimed that she could not remove her veil to show the policeman who she was. That seems very inaccurate, as the police officer who asked to remove a veil and was denied due to religious freedom, he could have just asked for a female officer to be there so that the female officer could have her remove her veil, and then they wouldn't have that excuse. The officer might have had his own reasons for deciding not to do that, but it was not the fault of discrimination laws, and it certainly was not the fault of Elizabeth, who was right next to the wife kidnapper as she dug her nails into Elizabeth's thigh the entire time the officer was talking to her. And when she was finally caught by other officers, she did eventually tell them who she was. The police simply had to get her out of earshot of her kidnappers before she was willing to say anything. This was not a matter of someone being brainwashed by her church. This was a matter of someone being scared for her life. I can excuse the woman who was interviewed in the book for projecting her own religious trauma and speculation onto the situation. She likely did not have the full information about the case, and with her own trauma, it's easy to understand why she would think this wouldn't happen to a non-Mormon girl. But the professional writer of a true crime book about Mormon crime, presenting itself as caring about female victims of religious abuse, just letting that speculation slide, is horrible on multiple levels, the least of which being that I can't trust any of his takes in the rest of the book. The other child. Too much small town judginess and gossip. I'll take like 7 murders over an adult being mean to a child because they don't try to understand her. I just couldn't deal with it. Leave the world behind. This might have been a format issue. The book changes perspective a lot, and it gets to a point early on where the point of view is changing like every sentence. But listening to it on audio, there's not enough cues to tell you when those perspective shifts are happening until you get to the end of the sentence. And then by the end of the next sentence, it's changed perspectives again. If there's a paragraph break or font differences in the print version, that wouldn't be an issue, but on audio it really was. And the last one is the turning. I didn't realize until a bit into the first chapter that this was a young adult retelling of Turn of the Screw. Turn of the Screw isn't a whodunit like And Then There Were None, so retellings can't be very surprising. And I'd already seen Bly Manor, which was based on Turn of the Screw, so it had to hook me with either character or format. However, the format was that each chapter is a letter written by the narrator, and they were written in a very, as you already know, kind of style, instead of working the exposition in more naturally throughout the book, and it made the structure really weak. The protagonist also wasn't very likable, or maybe I should say the author wasn't very likable, depending on how much they were projecting. The protagonist exclusively refers to a couple he meets in the first chapter as the blind man and the blind man's wife, even after he has a conversation with them and knows their names. And then he goes out of his way to make a weird comment about how confused he was that the blind man used the phrase, "we saw." And on top of that, in the second chapter, very early in the book, he says he's surprised to meet his coworker and see that she's skinny because her last name is Gross, and he assumed that she would be fat. Nice. There were a few other books I just didn't finish because they had to be returned to the library, so that's why I didn't include those, but I'll probably get them out again at some point, and hopefully they'll be on next year's list. Bye!